Welcome back to Satori Sounds. In today's conversation, we explore commitment, creativity, and the pressure. Welcome back to Satori Sounds. Today, our conversation explores commitment, creativity, and the pressures that shape how we live. We talk about the importance of slowing down, making clear choices, and questioning the constant push to always do more or be exceptional. We'll also dig into why sometimes it's necessary to let go of your old ways of thinking, how saying no can be a powerful decision, and why defining success for yourself matters far more than meeting external expectations. If you're navigating a change or rethinking your direction, this episode offers a grounded look at how to improve and how to move forward with purpose on your own terms. You have to fully commit. Like you just have to go that far, don't you? You've got to go all the way.
I think that's just the crux of everything in life. You have to go that far. You can't rise from your ashes unless there are flames. You've got to burn everything down.
We've said that in the last episode, didn't we? Sometimes you just got to burn it all, and that's okay. Like there's such a resistance to want to just burn it down, but sometimes you do, and it's amazing. A bit like a wildfire, and then the first bits of kind of green vegetation growing through. Sometimes you need that completely just to reset, and I've noticed that over the last couple of weeks of kind of just suddenly stopping and having a bit of free space where the brain just starts to go again and new ideas come. But that I know I wasn't in that headspace 4 weeks ago. I was in like a survival mode then.
No one's brain does its best thinking in survival mode because it really is stress management. It's a completely different system of operating in. And it's reactive. Whereas creativity, in all its forms, is always proactive. You're not just going, this thing's come up, I'm going to do that. No, you're thinking, you're sketching out ideas in your mind. And I mentioned earlier in the last episode, that the society we live in does not reward proactivity. In fact, it's the opposite. Everything that we engage with today as human beings is purely reactive. We are in the age of like this, buy that, the age of marketing. And that rewards reactivity.
Too true. It's that now culture that we spoke of before, but it's funny in a way because creativity, you can't plan for it. I think that's why so many people maybe struggle with it as well, because just having that space, giving yourself the space to think or slow down and be creative. You can't just be like, I'm going to do it for 1 hour and I'll come up with something. You can't plan it like we can with everything else.
Imagination is purely impromptu, and that's just the nature of the beast. It's the name of the game. Any great work of art didn't start with a seriously considered plan. Someone was just sitting around being like, I want to do that. What would that mean to do? Same with literature, same with poetry.
Yeah, it's all unplanned. But I think there's a bit of excitement in that unplanned element. The short trip that I've just done with a close friend of ours, where he'd originally planned to go all the way to the Balkans, had it all planned out, how many miles he had to do per day, how far he had to get, what day he was doing where. It was planned almost to the nth degree. And unfortunately, through its own circumstances, that trip didn't happen. It kind of got cut short, and I flew out last minute to visit him. And we had an amazing trip, just cruising through Italy and down into Croatia over a kind of a week and a bit. But the bit that I realised was that how much a slower pace of life some of these individuals are living out in those countries. Some of the areas in northern Italy, they still have planned work days, but they don't focus around everything. Not everything is planned to the nth degree. Even lunch, they typically said on half the buildings they closed around 12:30 and they reopened around 3:00. They had slower pace of life, and we noticed even walking through some of the cities, we're almost walking at double the pace of some of these other individuals. And it really kind of got me thinking and observing of actually, hold on, we can in a way race through life, and we've talked about tools of building momentum and consistency, but actually sometimes in life you do need to just slow down. And it was amazing how much more I observed by the end of that week from just slowing down.
I think you're touching on a really, really powerful societal thing, and I think it's everything to do with ideology. So we in Britain, and I'm going to isolate this to Britain generally,
Mm.
but we kind of have the bulkhead of Western thought, of this idea of individualism and economy driving us as people, that we've always got to produce something, we've always got to make something, we've always got to be something. Having that constantly in the forethought is going to cause you to rush. Whereas in smaller provinces, smaller areas, places with less industry, maybe they have not so much of that mission mentality in
Hmm.
their minds because they're not driving forward with a Western individualist conception of what life should be. They're approaching it from this idea of, well, this is life.
Hmm.
I don't need to be the shooting star. And as a result, they tend to be a bit happier. And I think that's what we see a lot of in our culture. And it does lead to a lot of unhappiness. And I don't know why we don't see anyone commenting on that at all. Social media gurus,
Mm.
um, influencers, anyone. A lot of people will sit there and be like, oh, it's idiosyncratic. It's something to do with you. That's why you're not happy. But there is a lot to do with the world around you. And there's a great study of that. So there's it's called the Rat Superhighway or the Rat Metropolis study. I can't remember who the original author was, but effectively they put rats in two separate conditions. So the first condition, almost like countryside life, basically, is a smaller rat population. They weren't really doing anything. There were, I suppose, self-contained areas which they could live in, and then they did another condition, which was this rat superhighway, and they found that the rats living in the superhighway, this rat metropolis, if you like, were way more stressed, way more likely to engage in behaviours that harmed themselves and also other rats around them, and there were just all these drawbacks. So yeah, I think what you're
Mm.
talking about there speaks to that.
It's amazing. And we use that terminology throughout our societal kind of life here in the UK, right? People talk about recession being this awful thing where we're not growing. Now, I'm not looking at it from an economic point of view here. I'm looking at a larger scale, right? But actually, should we always be growing? Or actually, naturally through process, sometimes things need to slow down or they need to evolve, right? So, this whole idea of slowing down or regressing doesn't need to necessarily be seen as a bad thing, and I think it is penalised in a way, especially in our societies. You talk about this kind of rat race, and it's this subliminal message of you've got to do the next thing or where are you moving next. And people have spoken to me about it in my career. I'd set a goal, set a plan, I'd implement it, smash it, move to the next one. And people, when I remember getting chartered, they were like, "What's next? What's next?" And I got a
Mm.
bit tired of it. Really, I was like, I can't keep coming up with these answers, and I realized at that point that actually sometimes just enjoying the journey instead of the destination, right, is a lot to be. There's a lot to be said for that, and we've talked about ikigai as well before with the Japanese concept, and I think bringing that together. What I noticed and observed in some of these kind of regions in the northern Italy is that people are just happy with where they are right now with something. Things will get done, but there isn't this sense of sudden urgency that everything's got to be now, and there's this state of stress. People are slowing down. There's a thing called a tahoot in northern Italy where people stop around 5, 6 o'clock and just go for a single drink for the couple of friends, talk about the day, and then carry on with their evening. And it's funny because they just stop, pause, and just talk through their day. We have to schedule time in to see people half the time, or we're kind of drinking to forget, or, there's drinks seem very differently. And that was fascinating to me just to see how these people kind of live a slower pace, but also a lot more, from my perspective, a lot more intentional pace. They're not just
Mm.
flying through life.
Yeah, I think where you can really see the change in Britain is probably around the Industrial Revolution. Sort of that era where our culture really started to change, and you started to see less and less and less of that idea of, I suppose, let's go for a drink. And we, I suppose, from my point of view, and you can see it in sort of modern television programs and contemporary television programs, these snapshots of British culture
Mm.
before, where people used to go, oh, let's go to the pub for a drink to have a cool off. Let's go do this to have a cool off. Let's have this set time where we go and do that to relax. And that has slowly faded away. And I think it's largely pushed by that constant desire for exceptionalism. and
Yeah.
doesn't exist. That's the thing that we're being programmed to look at. I think personally, is that idea of you need to be constantly, as you put it, growing. I'd go a little bit further. You need to be constantly conquering almost. If you're
Hmm.
not a world leader, if you're not on the Forbes under 30 list by now, what are you doing? And I think if you see a lot of people's feeds on social media or maybe newspapers, things like that, there is that constant narrative being fed to us from right when we're in school. A good example would be like, think about the kid that's made £300 in the tuck shop. Why aren't you doing that? It's just like, what?
It's so true, and there is that force-fed kind of sausage machine way where you're just trying to be pushed through this educational system and onto the next thing, onto the next thing, and actually, I think people are waking up more and more nowadays and realizing that this one size fits all doesn't really work. The amount of people that I know that I jokingly, when I've said, "Oh, I've had enough. I'm just going to go buy an island and disappear," half-heartedly. The amount of people are like, yeah, I just want to do that. I've had enough. And actually, I think what it's showing is that where we are at the moment doesn't really work for everyone. And actually, for those people that are
Mm,
listening in and saying, I don't quite feel I fit in or I'm not sure where I'm going, that's okay because this whole societal change, I think, is happening for better or worse. And that's a different discussion. But
mm.
getting a standard job, getting a standard mortgage, going through this career ladder, jumping through the hoops, having kids at a certain point. Kids. We're having kids later in life in our generation, and I think the next generation it will happen again. Right? These societal norms are changing massively, and I think where I'm kind of getting to with all of that is that I think we do need to rethink an element of what is it to live an intentional life because you don't need to be Forbes 30 under 30. But not everyone is going to be able to reach that, right? That by sheer numbers, that's impossible. And so, actually, I
Mm.
think for individuals, what we're saying is you have to work out what you want as an individual and what is your goal. And you can turn up every day and just bring the best you can. So, that might just be the humble farmer. That person in northern Italy who is just curating the best possible vegetables that they can. Or it is that investment banker in the centre of London. That's okay as long as you're being true to yourself.
And I think, I suppose, to add to that notion as well, is we touched on it in our previous episode, like a little while ago, and it comes back to Nico Mancini ethics, is there's beauty in that. And you don't have to be the high flying uh, wizard, for instance. It's whatever you're doing, do it well. That's effectively the summary of what Aristotle says in that school of thought. And I suppose it comes back to this notion as well of you don't have to be the best thing. You just don't. Um, and I think when you start to measure your life in that sort of mission,
Mm-hmm.
you're setting yourself the parameter of succeeding or failing. Well, you don't fail life. And that's the problem. We, as a society, we're setting people up to be like, well, you failed, or you haven't done very well, or you're just. And we mentioned this language a little while ago in I think it was the last episode. The term "you're just this" so destructive, and it is a catalyst to that failure mentality that doesn't really exist. And when we're asking this question of what does it mean to live an intentional life, just start by asking what does it mean to live, and then being intentional fits into that. And that's part of the problem. No one's in our, from what I would understand, or you look at the modern
Mm-hmm.
school, you look at media, no one's asking those questions. No one's sitting and saying to you, what does it mean to live? What does it mean to you to go and live? Does it mean being the farmer? Does
100%.
it mean being, I don't know, veterinary practitioner?
100%. And by all measures, right? I can happily sit there and say, by societal measures, I failed. I'm nearly 30. I
Mm.
have no mortgage. I currently have no steady income from a job because I decided to leave. You know, I haven't got married. I aren't on, I've got a degree for what I wanted to do, but I did that degree later than I was 18. So it's funny because I don't think I failed. I don't feel like I failed, but if I look
No.
on societal paper, one could argue that I have failed, and so I think I think there's a lot to be said for that for people, and I've really observed it from slowing down and just seeing people who are happy and content living through their life. I went to this winery in Croatia, and there's an individual there who is the third generation living after this land, and he was asked by some of his producers, "How many bottles of wine are you going to give us this year?" And he said, "I don't know. Depends how good the grape wines are." When they said, "Well, no, we've got a contract with you. We need you to guarantee, there needs to be a guarantee of what you're producing." And he said,
Oh, yeah.
"Well, I'll pray for good rain, and I'll pray for good sun, and I'll pray for favourable weather conditions, and a good yield of grapes." But, and he stopped, interestingly, mass producing all his wines and has brought it all back locally. And they produce what they produce. And it really got me thinking, because we kind of put that on ourselves a lot, where you have to do all this the whole time. You've got to achieve that. And if you've not, then you've failed. But actually, what if we did just change those parameters slightly, and we just turned up and did what we could that day? Or, you just progressed that thing. And we've talked about it from a fitness perspective before, but for people who maybe don't think they are, maybe they haven't got the mortgage, maybe they haven't achieved what they wanted to. Well, actually, are you setting that goal too high for where you are at the moment? Or are you chasing someone else's goal because that's what society tells you?
I want to come back to something you highlighted, just thinking about your parable there. Someone goes, how many grapes or how many bottles of wine are you going to be able to produce? And he's like, I don't know. I think, well, that's not good enough. We've got a contract with you. What I want to come back to is this notion that an exceptionalist society cannot tolerate uncertainty. And as a result, you'll often see this in your job, in your close circle of friends, maybe out at dinner, at an event, or whatever it is. As soon as things become a bit unknown, a bit unclear, people panic. And that's because perfectionism cannot adapt. Perfectionism says, this is the plan, we're doing it like this. Has to be perfect. It's a preconceived notion. And as soon as you step away from that, that's when you start to notice that reactionary take. Well, we can't do this. Oh my God, it's all fallen to pot. And you notice it at a societal level, but you'll notice it at an individual level. And it's how you react to other people's inability to tolerate uncertainty. And if you choose to take that on, because that's the invitation, oh my God, what are we going to do? Solve the problem. You've got to be aware. Am I now agreeing? Am I going to that problem solver party? Is that what I'm going to subscribe to or not? You don't have to.
You don't. And that's exhausting to do. I've been in that state where you do think you've got to solve the next problem and move to the next one. And actually, as you say, you can, what we're saying to people here is that invitation is a choice. Do you want to be involved in that? Or actually, do you want to step back from it and go, that one's not for me? And I definitely had to learn to do that. But I think slowing down and having that observation, or that pause of just saying, is this something that I want to entertain with? Is that observation piece that we've talked about before, that kind of awareness, and then acting on that. And I think that's a real key point you're making there is, do people want to engage? It's a choice.
It goes a bit beyond observing. You have to then be able to internalize and analyze what's going on. Because if we notice it, that's one thing, but we have to now choose how we react. And that requires us to almost sometimes get into the nitty gritty of it. What's actually happening here? What's the function of what this person is doing? Or what's the function of what I'm doing here? Does it bring me closer to what I want to achieve, or does it not? And that is a type of rudimentary analysis that we'll all be doing cognitively. And you need to get into that habit realistically.
It's exhausting, isn't it? It's that intentionality piece, as you say, of how, and does it align with the values? We've talked about that before as well. That can be a helpful way to decide with people, is if you're trying to decide whether you want to get involved with something, does it align with the values of what you want to do? And I've noticed that with slowing down as well, is not saying yes to everything. It's incredibly hard not to. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, right? But actually learning to say no to certain things, it's okay. This whole FOMO attitude of I'm going to miss something, right? If we think how much is out there nowadays and how many parties, events, things that are happening, it's okay to say no. If you need that evening just to slow down and take some time to yourself because you're mentally exhausted, you shouldn't then sit there beating yourself up because you're worried of that societal pressure of not going out. That's okay. You don't need to be there, do you? That whole time, you don't need to be at every event.
Yeah, although I suppose there are going to be people which part of their job that they're going to have to be there, and it is noticing the difference that you're not really there because you want to be there. So you're, I don't know, you're networking at some event because you want that social currency to be able to jump onto the next job and climb up the ladder and do all those things, because you're trying to avoid this sense of stagnation or feeling like a failure. And I suppose be very aware of that. Are you doing things just to avoid being a failure? Because as we said earlier, you don't fail life. It's not an exam that you go, oh, that's it. That was my run. There's nothing more I can do. It doesn't work like that. It's not a pass mark.
So true. And as you said at the start of the episode, right? Don't be afraid to burn it down. We can just change. We've talked about the pressures of being able to change, but the weight, the actual weight of making the decision to change, I think is different. I think a lot of people don't change because they've kind of gone down this path and they feel that that's all there is. They've got to stick with that. But actually, you can burn it down. You can change, and you can learn through, various teachings or just by researching yourself of different ways to turn that corner, whatever that corner may be for you as an individual.
But we're doing what I just noted earlier on. We are now turning it into an idiosyncratic idea, that we're saying it's in your individual gift, that it has to be you inherently. But there are things that it's not you. That actually there will be situations in society, like what we've just described. The societal narrative is you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this, and it's going to cause you some stress initially. But it's recognizing that that's not up to you to change the societal parameter there, but it's to become comfortable with it to some degree. Like, well, I don't fit that mold. That's the only bit that you can work on. Everything else outside of that, if it's external, you have to begin to say that's just how the world is. Can't change them like that. And I suppose that's the other element of that we have to bear in mind, is that there will be a degree of nuance. We're not saying everything has to be you. Sometimes it's just not engaging with a system.
That's very true. Choosing not to engage is part of that, isn't it? We're saying you make all these decisions, but that can be part of it, is choosing not to engage or choosing to separate yourself from something, or choosing to tolerate it, as you say, because there's that social currency of moving up in a role. But I think that the way I'd interpret that is it's that controlling the controllables again, isn't it? Right? You can't necessarily control how all these other people are going to behave or act, but you can control your own reaction to that and how you handle those situations. And I think that's also a lot easier to do when you are moving at a slower pace, because I think when we're moving at such a faster pace, it's harder to maybe pick up on those things, or you might impulsively react to something. We all know this if we're under stress, where actually we might slip and say something that maybe we didn't mean in a certain tonality, etc. Whereas if you're in a slightly slower pace, you can be more considered in your point of view or what you're going to say. So I think again what we're saying there for the listeners is that slowing down piece, and just, if you can, observe yourself, or if you're moving at pace, just try and be more conscious, because subconsciously you're going to trip yourself up.
Yeah, and we've spoken before at how stress basically eats into your cognitive resources. Different models frame it like you're going to be in what's called the threat system, so you're just going to be purely reactive. You're not going to be thinking the same way. You're purely in survival mode. There's so many different ways to slice it. But one of the things I want to introduce now is the idea of micro and macro systems. So it's straight from ecological theory that the micro system is your immediate vicinity. And it touches on what you noted earlier, this idea of control the controllable. Well, there's going to be a whole macro system that you're living within. So maybe it's the work culture, maybe it's the organization. There's going to be so much of that you cannot touch. And if you're listening to this episode today, the best thing I would advise, I suppose, from my point of view and thinking about where I am in my life, is to know what is in your system, what is within your gift to change. And it doesn't necessarily have to be you internally. It could also be things in your immediate environment. Once you've identified that microsystem, what's the bigger system around you? Is it the organization itself? Is it maybe, I don't know, it could be anything in terms of that bigger organization, depending on where you work. It could be a school, could be university, could be, you maybe starting your career, you could be 30 years down your career. It could be a little bit further. It might be, so if maybe you're involved in local government, what is your macro system? Work through that. Think about what systems are driving different influences in your life.
I think that influences point's really key, because I think if people start to unpack that, they'll probably suddenly realise that there's a load of elements to that macro system that is influencing them that they may not have realised. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? I think maybe people could go, oh my God, I didn't realise I've been influenced by that. But actually doing the work in the first place of realising it is enough. You don't need to beat yourself up. We've talked about it before with the Johari's window, that you're not going to be able to see necessarily how everyone else sees you. And that's okay, but it's understanding those other influences, what they might be, and then being able to address them suitably, because it's we can't map it all out. We've talked about this before in this episode, where it's not all linear. There isn't going to be a succeed. I can't define everything in that macro environment and be able to react perfectly to it. That's not what you're saying there. It's saying being aware that there are these external influences.
And I would say that if you're in that stage of over planning, you might be suffering from worry. That's usually when sort of that over planning is an attempt at control, and that is too much looking to the future. You're being swept up in that. I need to mitigate. I need to control. I need to manage, and there will be things you can't manage. It's just the nature of it in many ways. And I suppose trying to over plan what influences you and what doesn't influence you is a bit like trying to stop the waves breaking on the shore. You're never going to do it, but you can understand different waves bring in different sediment of rock and sand and so on and so forth, and different things in from the sea, and it's recognizing that.
It is, and how being able to navigate those waves, right? Isn't it? And seeing maybe when not to get in the sea, or maybe not, and that's the point, engaging with situations and not.
Yeah. When's the red flag saying the tide's coming in? Don't jump in. Don't go for a swim.
100%.
And there will be times like that in your life.
We can talk about that with the podcast, can't we, right? Where we started, we had the first couple of episodes in, and they were loosely planned, but then we rigidly planned, and we really noticed a drop-off in kind of the quality of our content, and we had to record a couple of episodes 2 or 3 times, and now we're in more of a format where it is loosely unplanned in a way. We have sometimes a rough idea that we want to talk about. Other times we don't, right? And actually we navigate that uncertainty. We don't have everything planned out. What we show to the world through our kind of Spotify podcasts they're loosely edited, but within reason. They are very subtly edited to what we put out to people. That is unplanned. And actually, I guess what I'm trying to say to people and everyone out there is that you can navigate uncertainty. You don't need to plan everything out.
Yeah. And I suppose just to come back, there's a risk of doing that. We're not going to sit there and tell you that that's not risky business. Using our podcast episode, for instance, we don't plan anything, a particular therapeutic topic or anything like that. We could just have a dud episode, just have nothing to record, nothing to release, and that's risky. So there is a risk of having that uncertain bracket.
Yeah.
But that's where that feeling of worry comes from. We're trying to mitigate a risk. And when you're overly mitigating a risk, that is what leads to the stagnation. And we found that in the inverse, where we've overplanned an episode. So it's a balance, of course, but I suppose in life you have to be willing to take the risk. So this idea of going, I'm going to fail this thing, you may not. And you've got 2 options. You can stay exactly the same, how you are right now, or you can take the risk and see if it works out. Because your old life's going to be there.
100%. And that risk mitigation piece, I think, is really key for people, because everyone's tolerance to risk is going to be completely different depending on their own circumstances, what they're feeling, the worry, and what they can tolerate, right? But we've been able to create this environment where we can loosely plan because we're running a few episodes ahead of ourselves. We've created the space, we've created the environment to be able to take on a bit more on risk and therefore engage in a looser style of conversation instead of planning it out, right? And I think what I wanted to highlight there for people is that if you can, we don't need to overplan, but if you can understand where the risk is, and like you say, that little bit of mitigation is learn to mitigate that, so you can try things, and you'll see that exponential curve come and get time and time again, as we said before, where one day you'll look
Yeah.
back from taking all these mini risks and you'll realize how far you've come.
I think risk aversion, realistically, in the long run, is going to stunt your growth. It always does. And we're not saying we're using terms like tolerate risk. There will be some people who cannot afford to take that risk. Make no mistake, we're not saying that you have to chuck it all in and go absolutely crazy. That's not the idea, I suppose, in many ways. But it is thinking about, if you're going to make a change, it is risky business, whatever that change is. It may not work.
But that's the beauty of the point of not failing, right? The only time you do fail is by not trying again.